That morning, I checked my retirement account. It was completely empty. My son-in-law called me and said, "Pop, the gallery opens Saturday. I used your investment account to cover the build-out, and I had the lake house signed over too. Don't make this difficult." I said nothing. I made one phone call. By Saturday night, he wished he never had. Let me tell you exactly how this started. It was a humid Tuesday in June, the kind of Savannah morning where the air sits on your skin before you've even stepped outside. My name is Walter Pruitt. I'm 68 years old. I was on my back porch with a cup of chicory coffee, going through a stack of mail I'd let pile up for a week, when I opened my banking app to pay the property tax bill. The number on the screen wasn't the $612,000 I'd checked 3 days earlier. It read $1,140. For a man who spent 34 years as a structural engineer signing off on bridges and high-rises across the Southeast, you'd think a number like that would have sent me into a panic. You'd think I'd have dropped the phone, called the bank screaming, maybe felt my chest tighten the way it did the year Carol got sick. But panic was never useful to me. Not on a job site, and not in my own kitchen. I sat very still and looked at the number until it stopped feeling like a mistake, and started feeling like a message. That $612,000 wasn't pocket change I'd never miss. It was what was left of Carol's settlement, the one we got after the malpractice case that should have saved her, and didn't. We'd agreed, before she passed 2 years ago, that the money would eventually go towards something that mattered. She'd talked about scholarships for kids in the foster system, the kind of kids who age out with nothing and nobody. I'd been quietly building toward that for 2 years, a little at a time, letting the account grow, waiting for the right moment to make it real. And now, in the time it took me to drink half a cup of coffee, it was gone. Before I could even get my mind around the number, I heard a truck idling in my driveway, followed by the unmistakable sound of my own front door being propped open with a rubber wedge. I walked through the house and found 2 men in coveralls carrying my grandfather's cedar hutch out to a moving truck, the same hutch Carol had refinished by hand the year we got married, sanding it down on our back porch over 3 straight weekends. "Excuse me," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "What exactly are you doing with that?" The older of the 2 men set his end down gently, more out of habit than respect. "We're just following the work order, sir. New owner wants the place cleared by Friday." New owner. I let those 2 words sit in my chest for a second. I asked to see the paperwork. He handed me a clipboard, and there it was, an authorization for an expedited estate transfer. My own house listed as the property. And at the bottom, a signature I knew instantly. Not my son's. I never had a son. It was my son-in-law, Garrett Voss, married to my only daughter, Hannah, for 6 years now. The same Garrett who used to call me Pop at Thanksgiving and ask my advice about his car. The same Garrett who, 18 months ago, convinced Hannah and me both that he had a sure thing, a contemporary art gallery downtown, the kind of investment that would finally put their name on something real. I'd told him no the first time he asked me to put money into it. I told him art galleries are a luxury business built on rich people's boredom, and that I'd watched plenty of sure things collapse in my career. I told him if he wanted to build something, he should build it slow, the way I built my career brick by brick, with his own hands and his own risk. Apparently, that conversation had stuck with him in exactly the wrong way. I folded the paperwork and handed it back. "Be careful with the hutch," I told the mover. "It's older than my marriage." They exchanged a confused look they'd expected, shouting, maybe tears, the usual performance of an old man losing his home. I gave them nothing. I walked back inside, sat down at my kitchen table, which had not yet been carried off, and let the cold, clear part of my mind take over. The part that used to walk a construction site and find the one beam that was going to fail before anyone else could see it. Garrett and Hannah's wedding hadn't been extravagant, not by their standards anyway, but the gallery launch, that was the real spectacle. Garrett had been talking about it for months. A black tie opening with a rooftop view of the river. 200 guests. Write-ups promised from 3 different lifestyle magazines. He needed real capital to make it happen on the scale he wanted, more than the modest savings he and Hannah had put together, and he had decided, somewhere along the way, that an old man who'd had his time didn't need that money sitting untouched in an account. I walked out to the garden, where Carol's rose bushes still bloomed every June like clockwork, and I called my attorney, a sharp, quiet man named Desmond Cole who'd handled my estate planning for 15 years. "Desmond," I said, "it's time for the contingency file." He didn't ask a single question. He just said, "Understood, Walter," and hung up. But contingency wasn't enough. I needed proof. I needed Garrett's own voice, on the record, admitting exactly what he'd done and why. I opened the recording app on my phone, the one I'd used for years to document site inspections, and I called him. The line picked up on the second ring, and I could hear the unmistakable buzz of a construction crew behind him, drills, hammering, someone shouting about paint color. "Hey, Pop," he said, sounding distracted, almost cheerful. "Kind of a bad time. We're 3 days out from opening." "Garrett," I said, my voice flat. "There are men in my house taking my furniture. My investment account is empty. Where's my money?" A pause. Then the noise behind him faded, like he'd stepped into a back office. When he spoke again, the casual warmth was gone, replaced with something colder, more rehearsed. "Pop, listen. I know this feels sudden, but you have to understand the bigger picture here. This gallery isn't just my future. It's Hannah's future. It's your grandkids' future, if we're being honest about where things are headed. You sold my house," I said, making sure every word landed clearly into the recording. "I restructured an asset," he said, like he was reading off a business plan. "You're 68, Pop. You don't need a 5-bedroom house and a 6-figure account just sitting there collecting dust. I'm not stealing from you. I'm putting that money to work, finally, instead of letting it rot in a savings account, because you're too cautious to ever spend it. End. That money was for Carol's scholarship fund," I said. "You knew that." He actually laughed, short and sharp. "Carol's been gone 2 years, Pop. A scholarship fund for kids you've never met isn't going to bring her back. This gallery is real. This is happening right now, in front of real people. You are going to let that money just sit there forever. Consider this your contribution. Think of it as an early wedding gift, 6 years late." "Where am I supposed to live, Garrett?" I asked, letting my voice crack just slightly, playing the part he expected. "That's not really my problem to solve today, Pop," he said. "Whatever the movers get for your stuff should cover a short-term rental. Honestly, at your age, something smaller might be good for you anyway, less to manage. Good luck with everything." End quote. The line went dead. Good luck. Those were his last words to the man who'd walked his bride down the aisle 6 years ago, because her own father wasn't in the picture. To the man who'd co-signed his very first car loan. I stood in the garden, surrounded by Carol's roses, and I felt something settle in me, not rage, something colder and far more useful. I looked down at my phone. The recording was saved. 1 minute and 51 seconds of a confession no lawyer in the world could talk his way around. I walked back through the house. The movers had finished the living room and were heading upstairs, toward the bedroom, toward Carol's closet, toward the cedar box where I still kept her wedding ring. Any reasonable man would have stopped them right there, called the police, made a scene in his own driveway. But I'd spent 3 decades reading load-bearing structures, finding the hairline crack that would bring the whole thing down eventually, and I knew the value of patience. If I stopped this now, it would become a messy, public family dispute. Hannah would defend her husband out of instinct. Garrett would have time to clean up his trail. I needed him standing in the open, exposed, with no time left to cover his tracks. So I turned my back on the movers and walked out to my truck. I'm not the kind of man people expect to be good with technology. Garrett used to make a small joke of it, the way I still preferred a paper planner to his phone calendar, the way I called him fancy for using an app to split a restaurant bill. What he didn't know was that for the last 12 years of my career, I'd consulted on the security systems for 3 different regional banks, reviewing vault architecture and digital access protocols as part of structural risk assessments. I understood far more about how money moved than he ever gave me credit for. I sat in my truck under the shade of the live oak in my front yard, opened my laptop, and connected through a secure line Desmond had set up years ago. I pulled the transaction history on the account, the real version, not the simplified summary the app showed me. There it was, an outgoing wire for $610,000, executed 2 days earlier, routed first through a holding account before landing somewhere else entirely. I traced the routing number. It wasn't going straight into Garrett and Hannah's joint checking account. It had passed through something called Vosland Creative Holdings LLC, a name I'd never heard before, registered only 4 months ago. My stomach didn't drop. It tightened, the way it does right before you find the answer you suspected all along. I called Desmond and read him the LLC name. "Give me 20 minutes," he said. It took him 12. Vosland Creative Holdings wasn't owned by Garrett alone. It had two listed members, Garrett Voss, and a woman named Priya Anand, listed as creative director of the gallery, with a business address that traced back to a loft apartment 4 blocks from the gallery space itself. An apartment Desmond's research quickly turned up that Garrett had been quietly paying the lease on for the past 5 months. I sat in my truck for a long moment, absorbing that. My daughter had no idea her husband had a business partner who was also, apparently, something else entirely. I had Desmond pull whatever public information he could on Priya Anand while I drove to the gallery space myself, parking 2 blocks away and walking the rest, the way I used to walk a job site before an inspection, quiet, watching, cataloging. Through the wide front windows, I could see Garrett directing a crew hanging lighting fixtures, gesturing with the easy confidence of a man who believed the hard part was already behind him. Priya stood beside him, close, laughing at something he said, her hand resting on his shoulder a half-second too long for 2 business partners discussing track lighting. I didn't go in, I took photographs instead, from across the street, the kind of patient documentation I'd built my entire career on. Then I went home, and I waited. 2 days later, the night before the opening, I drove back into town and parked outside Priya's loft. I wasn't proud of what I did next, but I'd learned a long time ago that there's a difference between snooping and gathering evidence, and the line is usually just a matter of what you intend to do with it. Through a gap in the curtains, lit by the blue glow of a laptop screen, I watched Garrett and Priya sitting close together at her kitchen table, a bottle of wine between them, going over what looked like floor plans and a spreadsheet. I couldn't hear them, not from the street, but Desmond had something better than my eavesdropping. He'd quietly subpoenaed the LLC's formation documents and banking records the moment he had legal standing to do so, using the recorded confession as probable cause for a civil fraud filing. What came back over the next 48 hours painted the full picture far more clearly than any conversation through a window could have. Vosland Creative Holdings hadn't just received my $610,000. It had also taken out a private loan for $450,000 4 months earlier, from an investment group that, on paper, looked respectable. Desmond, who'd spent a career untangling exactly this kind of paper trail, recognized the structure immediately. It wasn't a bank. It was a high-interest private lending operation run out of a strip mall in Jacksonville, the kind that didn't bother chasing unpaid debts through the courts. They had their own methods. Garrett hadn't just used my money to fund his half of the gallery. He'd used it to quietly pay down the interest on a loan he'd taken out without telling Hannah, a loan that was rapidly becoming unmanageable, and the gallery's grand opening wasn't a celebration. It was a desperate, high-visibility attempt to attract enough wealthy buyers in one night to cover what he owed before the lenders came looking for their money in person. He wasn't building a future. He was drowning, and he'd decided my retirement and my late wife's memory were the life raft he was entitled to. I sat with that for a long time. I thought about Hannah, who had no idea any of this was happening, who probably believed her husband had simply made a bold, confident business move with family support. I thought about Carol, who would have been heartbroken to know her name. Her memory had been used to bankroll a man's secret affair and a debt to people who didn't send polite collection letters. I did not feel sorrow anymore. I felt the same focused clarity I used to feel standing under an unfinished overpass, looking for the one flaw that would determine whether it stood or fell. The opening was set for Saturday evening. I had 4 days. I spent them quietly. I didn't confront Garrett again. I let him believe his silence had worked, that I'd folded the way he expected an old man to fold. I let him spend those 4 days hanging lights and ordering champagne, utterly convinced he'd gotten away with it. Desmond and I built our case methodically. We had the recorded confession. We had the wire transfer records. We had the LLC documents showing Priya Anand as co-owner, and bank statements showing the private loan from the Jacksonville lending group. We had photographs. What we didn't have yet was Hannah's knowledge of any of it, and I made the decision, one of the hardest of my life, not to call her and warn her ahead of time. I needed her to see it happen in real time, in front of everyone, because I knew that if I told her privately first, some part of her would find a way to forgive him before the truth had even finished landing. Saturday evening arrived warm and clear. I put on the same gray suit I'd worn to Carol's funeral, because it felt right, somehow, like armor. Desmond met me 2 blocks from the gallery with a folder of physical copies, in case the digital evidence needed backup, and we walked in together at 8 o'clock, exactly when the crowd would be at its thickest. The gallery looked beautiful, I'll give him that. String lights wrapped the rooftop railing, servers moved through the crowd with trays of champagne, and Garrett stood near the entrance in a tailored navy suit, shaking hands with people I assumed were the magazine writers he'd promised would show up. Hannah was beside him in a deep green dress, glowing with the kind of pride that made my chest ache, because I knew what was about to happen to that pride in the next 10 minutes. I found her first. "Hannah," I said quietly, pulling her slightly aside from the noise, "I need you to trust me for the next few minutes, whatever happens." She looked confused, a little worried. "Dad, what's going on?" I didn't answer her directly. Instead, I walked toward the small raised platform near the bar, where Garrett was clearly preparing to give some kind of opening toast. I caught his eye across the room, and for just a second, I watched something flicker behind his confident expression: surprise, then a flash of irritation, quickly smoothed over into a host's smile. "Pop," he said, walking over, lowering his voice. "I'm a little surprised to see you here, but I'm glad you came around. Let's not make tonight complicated, okay?" "I'm not here to make a scene, Garrett," I said evenly. "I'm here to support family. All of it." I let that hang for a moment, then I raised my voice just enough to carry to the small cluster of people nearby, the magazine writers, two members of the lending group I recognized from photographs Desmond had pulled, a heavy-set man in a gray suit who I'd later learn was the head of the Jacksonville operation himself, apparently invited as a silent investor, without anyone else in the room understanding what that silence had cost. "Before the toast," I said, loud enough now that conversation around us began to quiet, "I think people deserve to know exactly what funded tonight's beautiful event." Garrett's smile cracked. "Pop, don't." "My late wife's settlement," I continued, my voice steady, carrying across the suddenly silent room. $610,000, withdrawn without my permission, routed through an LLC co-owned by Garrett and his business partner, Priya Anand. I gestured toward Priya, who stood frozen near the bar, her face draining of color. "Used, in part, to make payments on a private loan from a lending group that does not, from what I understand, accept late payments gracefully." The heavy-set man in the gray suit went very still. Two of the magazine writers had already pulled out their phones, recording. "This is insane," Garrett said, his voice climbing, the polished host completely gone now. "You're embarrassing yourself, old man. You don't understand business." "I understand a load-bearing wall," I said quietly, "and I understand exactly which one you've been standing on." Hannah stood frozen beside me, her face moving through confusion, then horror, then something that looked like the floor genuinely dropping out from under her, as she looked between her husband and the woman by the bar whose hand, just hours earlier, had rested on Garrett's shoulder a little too long. I didn't say another word. I didn't need to. Desmond stepped forward and quietly handed a folder to one of the lending group's representatives, who flipped through it with growing tension on his face, then turned and said something low and urgent to the heavy-set man beside him. Whatever trust had existed between Garrett and his silent investors evaporated in that exact moment, replaced by the unmistakable look of men recalculating risk in real time. The rest of that night moved quickly, and not in the way Garrett had planned. The lending group's representatives left within minutes, taking their silence and their patience with them. Two of the magazine writers left without a single photograph of the artwork. Priya disappeared somewhere around 8:40 and, as far as I know, never spoke to Garrett again. Hannah stood very still in the middle of her husband's collapsing dream for what felt like a long time, then quietly took off her wedding ring, set it on the bar, and walked out without saying a word to anyone, including me. I let her go. Some moments belong to a person alone, even when you desperately want to follow them out the door. The weeks that followed were not dramatic, not in the way the opening night had been. They were procedural, methodical, the kind of slow unraveling I understood better than most. Desmond filed civil fraud and elder financial abuse claims, and the recorded confession made the case nearly impossible to contest. Garrett's attorney, when Desmond's evidence was laid out in full, advised him almost immediately to settle rather than risk a criminal referral. The $610,000 was returned to me in full within 4 months, along with a court-ordered penalty payment that Garrett will be working off for years. He lost the gallery within 6 weeks, without the lending group's continued patience or any of my money propping things up. The doors closed before a single piece of art ever sold beyond the items bought that opening night out of pity or curiosity. He lost Hannah within 2 months, the divorce moving faster than either of them expected once the full financial picture, including Priya, came out in discovery. As for Priya, the lending group apparently held her just as responsible as Garrett for the missing collateral, and from what little I've heard secondhand, she left the state entirely sometime that fall. Hannah moved in with me for a while, in the house that was now, finally, fully mine again. Restored piece by piece as the mover's truck made its return trips, the cedar hutch carried back through the same front door it had left through. We didn't talk about Garrett much in those first weeks. We talked about her mother instead, about the rose garden, about small things, the way grief and shame both need quiet, ordinary moments to heal around them. It's autumn now, almost a year later. I'm sitting on the same back porch where this all started, a cup of chicory coffee in my hand, watching the light come up over the garden Carol planted 30 years ago. The roses are done for the season, but the bushes are healthy, well-tended, ready for next spring. Hannah has her own apartment now, a good job, a quiet kind of peace I haven't seen in her since before any of this began. She comes by most Sundays. Last month, Desmond drove out with a final stack of paperwork, the last piece of something I'd been working toward for 2 years. The scholarship fund is fully established now, named for Carol, funded in full, the first 4 recipients already chosen from the local foster care system. Next spring, we'll award the first checks. I think about that night at the gallery sometimes, the silence that fell over the room right before everything came apart. Garrett thought my quiet, in those 4 days before the opening, meant I'd given up, that an old man with a bad memory and a soft heart had simply accepted his fate. He never understood that silence, in the right hands, isn't surrender. It's measurement. It's the careful, patient work of finding exactly where the structure is weakest, and waiting for the precise moment to apply the pressure that brings the whole thing down, clean and complete, with nothing left standing that shouldn't be. Family isn't the people who share your name. It's the people who show up and tell you the truth, even when the truth is hard to hear. And at 68, I've learned my life isn't winding down at all. It's just finally been built on solid ground. Quiet doesn't mean weak. Sometimes the calmest people are simply taking their time to see clearly before they act. What stayed with me most wasn't the money lost or recovered, but how love, once it's truly tested, finds its way back to the people who deserve it. Even after betrayal, there's still room to rebuild something honest, something rooted in truth instead of appearances. A small note for you. This story was written and fictionalized by AI for entertainment purposes, while hoping to share a little warmth and a positive life lesson along the way.